The world for 10-year-old Elara was a place of muted colors and hushed tones. Ever since the car crash that had stolen her parents 2 years ago, her life had been lived behind a veil of quiet grief, a silence that clung to her more stubbornly than the Montana dust on her worn boots. She lived at the Gable foster home, a sprawling old farmhouse on the edge of the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness. Mrs. Gable was a kind woman, her hands perpetually dusted with flour and her heart filled with good intentions, but she was also a woman stretched thin with 5 other foster children to care for and a farm to run. She provided Elara with a clean bed, warm meals, and clothes that fit, but she couldn't fill the cavernous empty space in the little girl's chest. Every day was a study in endurance. The school bus was a rolling cage of taunts and whispers, led by a boy named Kyle, whose own insecurities manifested as a particular brand of cruelty reserved just for her. He called her Ghost Girl. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Because of her silence and her pale, withdrawn face, his laughter was a sharp and jagged thing that chipped away at the fragile shell she had built around herself. "Look, it's the orphan," he'd sneer his friends, echoing his jeers. "Lost your parents? So you lost your tongue too." Elara learned to make herself small, to blend into the cracked vinyl of the bus seat, to stare out the window and pretend the jagged peaks of the mountains were a fortress that could protect her from the volley of words that felt like stones. Her only sanctuary was the vast wilderness that began where Mrs. Gable's property ended. Every day after the torment of school, she would escape into the deep woods, following deer trails and the whisper of the wind through the pines. Here in the cathedral of nature, she could breathe here. The silence was a comfort, not a weakness. She would talk to the squirrels and the jays, her voice a soft rustle of leaves telling them secrets she could never entrust to a human soul. It was in this wilderness that she first became aware of him, a local legend, a creature of myth and fear. The townspeople called him the Ghost Bison, a solitary giant who haunted the fringes of the national park. They said he was a rogue bull kicked out of his herd for his violent temper, a dangerous outcast who had gored a hunter's truck and chased hikers from the trails. He was a shadow, a mystery, a monster to be avoided at all costs. His real name was Solomon, though no one in town knew it. And for weeks, Elara only ever saw him from a distance, a massive dark shape moving through the trees, his presence a silent and powerful hum in the landscape. But she wasn't afraid of him in his solitude. She saw a reflection of her own in his rumored rejection. She felt a kindred spirit. One day the cruelty reached a new peak. Kyle and his friends had cornered her during recess, their words sharper, their shoves more insistent. Elara endured it with her usual stoic silence, but inside something had cracked. The bus ride home was a blur of hot tears she couldn't shed when the bus stopped at her long gravel driveway. She didn't head for the farmhouse, she ran. She fled toward the one place she felt safe, the woods, her small legs pumping, her lungs burning. She ran from the laughter, the whispers, the gnawing ache of being alone in the world. She ran until the sounds of the farm faded and were replaced by the rhythmic hush of the forest floor. She ran farther than she ever had before, her desperation pushing her deeper into the wilderness until her legs finally gave out and she collapsed in a small, sun-dappled clearing, sobbing into the damp earth, the tears she had held back for so long finally breaking free in a gut-wrenching torrent. She cried for her parents, for the life she had lost, for the constant thrum of pain that was her daily companion. She didn't know how long she lay there, a small broken heap in the heart of the wild, but when her sobs finally subsided, she felt a strange stillness in the air, a presence. She slowly lifted her tear-streaked face from the dirt, and her breath caught in her throat. Standing not 20 feet away was him, the Ghost Bison, Solomon. He was larger than she could have ever imagined, a mountain of shaggy fur and coiled muscle. His massive head was lowered, his horns like polished crescents of old ivory, and his eyes, dark and ancient, regarded her with an unnerving calm. This was the monster, the dangerous rogue, the creature of terrifying local legend. Her every instinct screamed at her to run, but she was paralyzed by a mixture of awe and exhaustion. He simply stood there, his breath misting in the cool air, his immense presence filling the clearing. Then she heard voices. From the edge of the woods, Kyle and his friends had followed her, their taunts cutting through the sacred. "Silence! Look, she's found a new freak to be friends with," Kyle shouted, his voice laced with nervous bravado. "The ghost girl and the ghost." Bison a perfect match, they laughed. But they didn't dare step into the clearing. The bison's presence was a palpable wall of power that even their foolish courage couldn't breach. Elara expected the bison to charge, to let out a roar of fury at the intrusion, but Solomon did nothing. He kept his gaze fixed on her, his dark eyes seeming to hold a question. Then he did something that would change Elara's fate forever. He let out a low, soft sound, a deep rumble that vibrated through the ground and into her bones. It wasn't a sound of aggression or threat. It was a sound of comfort, a sound that seemed to say, "I see you. You are not alone." In that moment, Elara's fear dissolved, completely replaced by a profound and inexplicable sense of connection. She saw past the legend, past the fear, and saw a creature as lonely as she was. They were two outcasts, two ghosts haunting the edges of a world that didn't want them, the bullies, their taunts falling flat against the bison's immense indifference. Eventually grew bored and retreated, their laughter fading into the woods. Elara was left alone in the clearing with the giant beast. She slowly pushed herself to a sitting position, her eyes never leaving his. He watched her, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm, a living metronome of peace. She stayed there for what felt like hours, the sun slanting through the trees, casting long shadows around them. She didn't speak, she didn't move, she simply existed in his presence, feeling a sense of safety she hadn't known since her parents. Arms were last around her when she finally stood up to leave, her legs shaky, but her heart strangely full. Solomon watched her go. He didn't follow, but he stood in the clearing until she was out of sight, a silent guardian watching over his newfound friend. As Elara walked back to the farmhouse under the bruised twilight sky, she knew something inside her had shifted. The daily hurt was still there, a dull ache in her memory, but it was no longer the only thing. She felt she now had a secret, a friend, a mysterious bison who had looked at her with her pain and had not run away. He had changed her fate without taking a single aggressive step. Have you ever found an unexpected connection with an animal that seemed to understand you in a way no human could? What is it about these silent bonds that can be so incredibly healing? The clearing in the woods became Elara's sacred space, her true home. Every day after school, she would bypass the farmhouse and slip into the forest, her heart pulling her toward the one being on earth who seemed to understand her silence. Their friendship blossomed in the quiet language of shared solitude. Solomon was always there, as if waiting for her. He would be grazing peacefully or resting under the shade of a great ponderosa pine. But the moment she entered the clearing, his massive head would lift, his dark eyes acknowledging her arrival. She would sit near him, sometimes leaning against the warm, rough bark of a tree, and she would talk, her voice soft and hesitant at first, then growing stronger as she shared the stories of her day. She told him about the biting words of the bullies, the well-meaning but distant kindness of Mrs. Gable, the hollow ache that filled her room at night. She told him about her parents, her memories of them like faded photographs. She was afraid of forgetting. Solomon would listen, his stillness a form of active engagement. He would chew his cud, his rhythmic grinding a soothing counterpoint to her whispered confessions. Sometimes he would let out a low grunt or a soft rumble, as if in response, a perfect conversational partner who never interrupted, never judged, and never offered empty platitudes. He simply was, and his presence was enough. Elara started bringing him gifts. At first, it was a perfect red apple she had saved from her lunch. She held it out on her flat palm, her hand trembling as he lowered his enormous head. His breath was warm and smelled of sweet grass and earth. He took the apple with lips as soft as velvet, his gentleness a stark contrast to his fearsome reputation. She began to study him, to learn his language. She noticed the way his ears would flick to catch the sound of a distant bird, the way he would swish his tail in contentment, the way his muscles would tense at the scent of a passing coyote. But they never tensed when she was near with her. He was completely At ease, a titan of the wilderness brought to peace by the presence of a small broken girl one afternoon. She grew bold enough to touch him. She reached out a tentative hand and stroked his shaggy forehead. The fur was coarse and thick, but beneath it she could feel the immense power and warmth of him. Solomon closed his eyes and leaned into her touch, a silent gesture of absolute trust. From that day on, their sessions often involved this gentle contact, her small hands grooming his massive head, untangling burrs from his thick mane while she hummed soft, tuneless melodies, songs her mother used to sing to her. The change in Elara was subtle at first, but undeniable. Mrs. Gable noticed that the girl's shoulders were no longer permanently slumped. She saw a faint glimmer of light returning to her once hollow eyes. There was a new resilience in her, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. She was still the ghost girl at school, but the name no longer had the power to shatter her. She had a secret, a source of strength that her tormentors could never touch. She knew that no matter how cruel their words were, at the end of the day, she had a friend waiting for her in the woods, a friend who was bigger and stronger and more real than all of them combined. Mrs. Gable also noticed the mud on Elara's shoes and the occasional piece of hay in her hair, and she began to worry. "Elara, where have you been going after school?" she asked one evening, her voice gentle but firm. "It's not safe for a little girl to be wandering in those woods alone." "I'm not alone," Elara whispered, looking down at her plate. It was the most she had said in a single sentence all week, but she couldn't bring herself to reveal her secret. She knew how the townspeople viewed the ghost Bison. They would never understand. They would try to take him away from her, and that was a thought she couldn't bear. Her investigation into Solomon's past was born of love and curiosity. She started spending hours in the local library, poring over old newspaper archives and park service records. She learned that a massive wildfire had swept through the region about 5 years prior, devastating a large swath of the national park. The reports mentioned that the main bison herd had been scattered and several animals were unaccounted for. In a dusty old scrapbook filled with clippings about local wildlife, she found what she was looking for, a small article about a hunter who had illegally shot and wounded a large bull bison near the edge of the park a few months after the fire. The bull had escaped but was believed to have been badly injured. The article included a grainy photo of the wounded animal, and even though it was blurry, Elara recognized him instantly. On his flank, she could see the faint outline of a scar, the same crescent-shaped scar she had traced with her own fingers on Solomon's side. The truth settled in her heart with a heavy certainty. Solomon wasn't a rogue kicked out of his herd. He was a survivor, a victim of human cruelty. He had likely been separated from his family in the fire, then shot and wounded by a hunter. His aggression wasn't malice. It was a memory of pain. His solitude wasn't a choice. It was a defense mechanism against a world that had shown him only violence. "They hurt you," she whispered to him the next day, her hand resting on his scarred flank. "They all hurt you, and then they blamed you for being afraid." Solomon nuzzled her hand in response, his dark eyes seeming to understand her words perfectly. Their shared experience of pain and loss created a bond that was now unbreakable, two survivors finding solace in each other's company against a world that had misunderstood them both. If this incredible story of healing and friendship is touching your heart, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more tales that prove the most profound connections are often the ones that are unspoken. Meanwhile, the bullying at school escalated. Kyle and his friends, frustrated by Elara's newfound resilience, grew more determined to break her. They had seen her disappear into the woods every day, and their curiosity had turned malicious. One afternoon they decided to follow her to discover her secret. Their jeers echoed through the trees as they trailed her. Their presence a violation of her sacred space. "Going to play with your imaginary friend's ghost girl," Kyle taunted. When Elara finally reached the clearing, she saw them lurking at the edge of the woods, and her heart sank. This was her one safe place, and now they were here to poison it with their hate. Solomon sensed the threat. Immediately he rose to his feet from his resting place, his body a wall of protective muscle between Elara and the intruders. "Look at the freak's pet monster," One of the other boys sneered, picking up a rock. "Let's see how tough he really is." "No," Elara cried, her voice cracking with fear. "Leave him alone." But it was too late. The first rock flew through the air, striking Solomon on his massive shoulder. The great bison flinched, but did not retreat. Another rock followed, striking his flank near the old scar. Elara ran forward, placing herself directly in front of Solomon, her arms spread wide as if she could shield his immense body with her own small frame. "Stop it!" she screamed, finding a voice she didn't know she possessed. A roar of pure protective fury. "You're hurting him, leave him alone." Kyle just laughed, his face a mask of ugly bravado. "Or what, ghost girl, you gonna cry us to death? Move out of the way before you get hurt." But Elara stood her ground, her small body trembling, but her resolve as solid as the mountain behind them. She would not let them hurt her friend. She would not let them turn him into the monster they wanted him to be. The standoff was tense, the air thick with hatred and fear. It was a confrontation that had been building for years, a battle between cruelty and compassion, and Solomon, the mysterious bison, was about to show the world that the deepest wounds can give rise to the greatest strength. The rain of stones continued, each one a sharp impact against Solomon's massive body, but the great bison stood his ground, his focus entirely on the small girl, shielding him with her life. Elara could feel the vibrations of his deep guttural rumbles through the solace of her feet. It wasn't the sound of anger, but of contained power, of a protector holding his rage in check for the sake of the one he was guarding. "Get out of the way, Elara!" Kyle screamed, his bravado fraying at the edges. As Solomon took a deliberate step forward, pawing the earth and shaking his immense head, "That thing is going to kill you. He would never hurt me." Elara shouted back, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even herself. "You're the ones who are the monsters, not him." That was the final straw for Kyle. His frustration and humiliation boiled over into a reckless act. He picked up a large, jagged rock and hurled it with all his might, not at the bison, but at Elara. The rock struck her on the arm with a sickening thud, and she cried out in pain, falling to one knee. It was a cry that broke the dam of Solomon's restraint. The moment the rock hit Elara, something ancient and primordial awakened in the great bison. His response was not the blind fury of a cornered beast. It was the calculated wrath of a guardian whose charge had been harmed. He let asterisk. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Out a bellow so powerful, it seemed to shake the very trees. It was a sound of pure protective rage, a declaration of war against those who would harm his friend. Then he charged. The motion was a terrifying spectacle of speed and power. 2,000 pounds of muscle and horn covering the 50 feet between him and the bullies in a matter of seconds. But even in his rage, there was a breathtaking intelligence to his actions. He did not aim for Kyle, he aimed for the space right beside him. He thundered past the boy, his massive shoulder brushing Kyle so closely that the bully was sent sprawling to the ground in a terrified heap. Solomon skidded to a halt in a spray of dirt and leaves directly in front of the other boys, his head low, his eyes burning with a cold fire that promised annihilation. If they made a single wrong move, he was a living wall, a gatekeeper of righteous fury, and he had made his message clear. The boys screamed a chorus of pure terror. They scrambled backward, tripping over roots and each other in their desperate haste to escape. They fled from the clearing, their taunts replaced by whimpers of fear, leaving Kyle alone on the ground, shaking and sobbing. Solomon turned his attention from the fleeing bullies to the remaining boy. He took one slow, deliberate step toward Kyle, who was now trying to crawl backward in the dirt. The bison lowered his head until his massive horns were mere inches from the boy's face. Kyle closed his eyes and whimpered, expecting the final fatal blow, but it never came. Solomon simply held his position, breathing heavily, his hot breath washing over the terrified bully's face. It was a display of utter dominance, a clear statement that he could end Kyle's life in an instant, but was choosing not to. After a long, tense moment, he let out a final snort of disgust and contempt. then turned his back on the boy and walked back to Elara's side. Elara was clutching her bruised arm, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and awe. Solomon nudged her gently with his massive nose, his previous fury completely gone, replaced by an overwhelming and tender concern. He made a low rumbling sound in his chest, the same comforting sound he had made when they first met. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, leaning her head against his warm, shaggy flank. "You saved me. You protected me." The incident did not go unnoticed. A park ranger named Frank Miller, who had been investigating reports of illegal hunting in the area, had been drawn by the commotion. He had witnessed the entire event from a distance through his binoculars. He saw the rocks being thrown, he saw Elara protecting the bison, and he saw Solomon's intelligent and controlled display of protective force. When he finally entered the clearing, he found a scene that defied all logic: a small girl with a bruised arm, calmly comforting a 2,000-pound bison, while the school's biggest bully was still curled in a fetal position 50 feet away. The story Kyle told back in town was a twisted, self-serving lie. He claimed the ghost bison had gone crazy and attacked them without provocation, and that Elara was a weirdo who had somehow provoked the animal. Fear and parental outrage spread through the small community like wildfire. The town council called an emergency meeting driven by panic and misinformation. They made a swift and terrible decision. The rogue bison was a danger to the community. It had to be removed, a euphemism for being hunted and killed by park officials. When Elara heard the news from a distraught Mrs. Gable, her world shattered all over again. They were going to kill her friend, her protector, her only source of comfort, because of a lie told by a cruel boy. "No," she sobbed. They don't understand. He was protecting me." That night, under the cold light of the moon, Elara made a desperate plan. She couldn't let them kill Solomon. She would run away with him. She would lead him deeper into the wilderness, where they could never be found. She packed a small bag with a rope, a flashlight, and the last of her apples. Then she slipped out of the farmhouse and into the darkness, heading for the clearing one last time. What happens when a child's love clashes with adult fear? Can one small voice of truth be heard over a chorus of panicked lies? The fate of the mysterious bison and the girl who loved him would be decided at dawn. The air in the clearing was thick with a pre-dawn chill and the weight of what was to come. Elara found Solomon waiting for her, a great shadow against the graying sky, his breath plumed in the cold air like the smoke from a dying fire. He seemed to know that something was wrong, his usual calm replaced by a restless energy. He nudged her with his nose, a soft question in the darkness. "They're coming for you, boy," Elara whispered, her voice breaking as she looped a soft rope gently around his neck, not as a restraint, but as a connection, a symbol of their bond. "We have to go. We have to hide where they'll never find us." She tugged on the rope, and to her amazement Solomon followed without resistance. He trusted her completely, willing to follow her into the unknown depths of the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness. They moved through the sleeping forest, a strange and silent pair, a small girl leading a giant beast away from the world of men. Their journey was a desperate flight against the rising sun. They climbed higher into the rugged terrain, their path illuminated by the first faint streaks of orange and pink on the horizon. The world below them, the small town, the farm, the school, began to feel like a distant dream. But they weren't alone back at the farmhouse. Mrs. Gable had woken to find Elara's bed empty, her heart seized with a cold fear. At the same time, Ranger Frank Miller was driving to the town hall to make a final plea to the council. Armed with his official report and his conscience, he had to make them understand what he had witnessed. Mrs. Gable found the note Elara had left on her pillow, a simple, heartbreaking message. "I'm sorry, I have to go protect my friend. Please don't let them hurt him." Mrs. Gable didn't hesitate. She called Ranger Miller and told him what had happened. "She's gone after the bison," she cried into the phone. "Frank, you have to find them before the hunting party does." The hunting party, a grim-faced group of park officials and the town sheriff, was already assembling at the trailhead, their rifles glinting in the early morning light. They had their orders to track and eliminate the dangerous animal before it could harm anyone else. It was a race against Time on the mountain slopes. Elara led Solomon to a hidden meadow, a small bowl of green grass and wildflowers, surrounded by a ring of ancient pines. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, a natural sanctuary. She thought they could be safe here, but as the sun climbed higher, the sound of distant voices and the baying of tracking dogs drifted up from the valley below them. They were being hunted. Solomon grew agitated, his ears swiveling, his nostrils flaring as he scented the approaching danger. Elara wrapped her arms around his massive neck, trying to comfort him and herself. "It's okay," she sobbed into his thick fur. "I won't let them take you, I won't." The hunters were closing in, their figures now visible at the edge of the meadow. The sheriff raised his rifle, taking aim at the massive bison. But just as he was about to give the order to fire, a single figure emerged from the trees, standing directly between the armed men and their target. It was Elara, her small body a defiant shield, her face set with a determination that was as fierce as any predator's. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice echoing across the meadow, a sound of pure, unadulterated courage. "You will not hurt him." The sheriff lowered his rifle, taken aback by the ferocity of the small girl's son. "Get out of the way, that's a dangerous animal." "His name is Solomon," Elara declared, her voice ringing with truth. "And he's not dangerous. He's my friend. He protected me from the boys who were hurting me, from the ones you should be punishing." At that moment, Ranger Miller and Mrs. Gable arrived breathlessly at the scene. "She's telling the truth, Sheriff," Ranger Miller said, stepping forward. "I saw the whole thing. Those boys assaulted her, and the bison was only defending her. My official report exonerates this animal completely." The sheriff looked from the determined girl to the calm bison standing peacefully behind her, to the earnest faces of the ranger and the foster mother. He saw the truth reflected in their eyes, a truth that was far more complex than the simple story of a rogue animal he had been told to believe. He lowered his rifle completely and turned to his men. "Stand down," he commanded. "There will be no hunt today." The relief that washed over Elara was so immense she almost collapsed. Solomon nudged her gently, steadying her with his great head. A silent thank you for her bravery. In the weeks that followed, the entire story came out, the truth of Kyle's bullying, the details of Solomon's heroism, and the deep, healing bond between the outcast girl and the outcast bison. Kyle and his friends were disciplined, their actions exposed to the community. The town that had once feared Solomon now saw him as a hero, a symbol of their own short-sightedness and a testament to the courage of a little girl. The town council not only rescinded their order, but they worked with the park service to have the hidden meadow and the surrounding area officially designated as the Solomon Sanctuary, a protected space where the great bison could live out his days in peace. Elara's fate was changed forever. She was no longer the ghost girl. She was the girl who had saved a bison, who had stood up to bullies, who had found her voice when it mattered most. Her friendship with Solomon had healed the deepest parts of her soul, filling the empty spaces with a sense of purpose and a love as vast as the Montana sky. Mrs. Gable officially adopted Elara a few months later, making the farmhouse a permanent home, filled not with sorrow, but with the warmth of a family forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. Elara would spend every day she could in the sanctuary with Solomon, their silent conversations continuing under the watchful eyes of the mountains. They were a living legend, a girl and her bison, a testament to the fact that the most mysterious creatures are often just waiting for one kind soul to see past their scars to the hero within, and that sometimes the fate we think is sealed is just waiting for a brave heart to come along and rewrite the ending. The years that followed were like a long, peaceful exhalation after a lifetime of holding one's breath. The Solomon Sanctuary became the heart of the small Montana community, a place of quiet pilgrimage for those seeking to witness the living legend of the girl and the bison. Elara, now 15, was no longer the ghost girl. She was a force of nature in her own right. She moved with a quiet confidence that was more powerful than any loud declaration. Her silence was no longer a shield against the world, but a tool with which to understand it more deeply. She spent her days volunteering with Ranger Frank Miller, Learning the intricate ecosystems of the wilderness that had become her truest home, she could track a mountain lion, read the story of a storm in the bent branches of an aspen tree, and feel the subtle shifts in the seasons with an intuition that was both learned and innate. Her bond with Solomon had deepened into a form of telepathy. They communicated across the rolling hills of the sanctuary with a simple look, a shift in posture, a shared sense of the world around them. He was the wise old king of his domain. His past trauma, a distant echo now replaced by the profound peace of acceptance he would often lie with. His great head resting near the fence line, while Elara sat on the other side doing her homework, or simply reading her presence. A constant reassurance that he was no longer alone in the world. The town had healed alongside them. Mrs. Gable's adoption of Elara had become official, and the farmhouse was filled with a boisterous warmth that had finally soothed the lingering chill of Elara's early grief. Even Kyle, the boy who had been the architect of so much of her pain, had undergone his own quiet transformation, now a lanky teenager working at the local feed and supply he would meet. Elara's gaze with a look of downcast respect and shame whenever she came in for supplies he would always carry the heavy bags to her truck for her. Never saying much, but his actions spoke of a long overdue atonement, a silent apology she had long since accepted with a grace he didn't deserve, but that she gave freely. One crisp autumn afternoon, she went to the store for a bag of mineral salt for the sanctuary's lit. Kyle was at the counter, heard the old-timers talking. He said, his voice cracking slightly as it still did when he was nervous. "They say this is going to be a bad winter, worst in 50 years. The squirrels are burying nuts like there's no tomorrow, and the bears went into hibernation a month early." Elara just nodded, her gaze drifting toward the mountains, their peaks already dusted with a premature blanket of snow. She had felt it too, a different kind of cold in the air, a stillness that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. World was waiting for something, and she felt a primal unease deep in her bones. That night she dreamed of Solomon, alone in a world of white, a blizzard raging around him, his great form struggling against a tide of endless snow. She woke with a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature in her room. The golden years were ending. The wilderness was about to test its heroes once more. Kyle's prediction and the old-timers' warnings proved to be tragically understated. The winter didn't just arrive, it descended upon the Absaroka-Beartooth range like a biblical plague. It began with a blizzard that lasted for 3 straight days, burying the landscape under a 4-foot blanket of snow. Then the temperatures plummeted to levels that shattered records, dipping to 30 and then 40 degrees below zero, with wind chills that were almost unimaginable. The world became a frozen masterpiece of brutal beauty. The pines wore thick coats of white, their branches groaning under the weight. The rivers and streams froze solid, their movement stilled into silent ribbons of ice. For the town, it was a state of emergency. The roads were impassable power lines snapped under the weight of the ice, leaving homes dark and cold. The community banded together, sharing resources, checking on the elderly, their shared hardship, forging a bond of resilience. But for the wildlife, it was a catastrophe. The deer and the pronghorn grew weak, unable to dig through the thick, icy crust of the snow to find forage. The coyotes and wolves grew desperate and bold, venturing closer to human settlements than ever before. Elara's primary concern was for Solomon. His 20-acre sanctuary was now a vast ocean of white, a prison of snow and ice. She and Ranger Miller tried to reach him on a Park Service snowmobile, but the drifts were too high, the machine getting bogged down every few hundred feet. They were forced to make the last mile on snowshoes, a grueling trek through chest-deep powder, their lungs burning with every frigid breath. They found him huddled in the lee of a rocky outcropping, his shaggy coat covered in a layer of frost. He was alive, but he was a different animal than the serene king of the summer. His eyes held a haunted look, a flicker of the old fear Elara hadn't seen in years. He was remembering the fire. He was remembering being wounded and alone and facing a world determined to kill him. The cold and the isolation had reawakened his trauma. "He's not doing well, Ranger." Miller observed, his voice muffled by his scarf. This kind of prolonged stress on an animal with his history, it's dangerous, he's regressing. Elara pushed forward through the snow until she reached the fence. She put her hand on the icy metal and spoke to him, her voice a quiet thread in the vast frozen silence. "I'm here, Solomon. It's okay, I'm here." He saw her and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. He took a step toward her, but his movements were sluggish, his great strength sapped by the relentless cold. They left him a bale of hay, the best they could do under the circumstances, and made the long trek back to the ranger station. Their hearts heavy with worry, the crisis escalated a week later. A distress call came in from a pilot. Flying the small plane over the back country, he'd spotted a large herd of elk, nearly 200 of them trapped in a high-altitude basin known as the Devil's Cauldron. An avalanche triggered by the initial blizzard had completely blocked the narrow pass that was their only way out to the lower winter grazing lands. They were stranded with no food source, surrounded by impassable snowdrifts and sheer rock faces. They were a herd condemned to a slow, agonizing death by starvation. The Park Service convened an emergency meeting. The options were grim. A ground rescue was impossible. The terrain was too treacherous, and the avalanche risk too high. An airdrop of hay was the only viable option, but everyone knew it was a stopgap measure at best. They couldn't drop enough hay to sustain a herd that large for the entire winter. It only prolonged their suffering. "There's nothing more we can do," the park superintendent said, his voice heavy with resignation. "We'll do the airdrops and hope for an early thaw, but realistically we have to prepare for the loss of that entire herd." Elara listened to the meeting via radio from the ranger station, her hands clenched into fists. She refused to accept their verdict. She pulled out a topographical map of the Devil's Cauldron, her fingers tracing the faint lines of the terrain. She knew these mountains better than anyone. She had walked these trails since she was a little girl. Her mind raced, piecing together a plan, a desperate, impossible plan that hinged entirely on one creature. "There's another way," she said to Ranger Miller, pointing to the map. "The old game trail, the one that goes over Serpent's Ridge. It's not on the official park maps, but the animals have used it for centuries. It bypasses the avalanche zone completely." "Elara, that trail hasn't been passable for decades. It's too narrow and treacherous, and it's buried under 15 feet of snow," Frank replied, shaking his head. "No animal could break a trail through that, not even a moose." "One animal could," Elara said, her eyes shining with a fierce light. "Solomon, he's strong enough, and he knows these mountains. He knows the old ways. If he could break the trail, he could lead them out." "Even if he could, why would the elk follow a bison?" Frank argued. "They're different species. They'd see him as a competitor, not a leader." "They will follow him," Elara insisted. "They will follow him because they will recognize what he is, a survivor, a king." Frank looked at the determined face of the young woman before him. He remembered the girl who had stood down a hunting party to protect her friend. He knew that when Elara believed in something with this much conviction, it was best to listen. "All right," he said slowly, "but first you have to get your king to agree to it, and from the looks of him today, he's fighting his own ghosts right now." Elara knew he was right before she could ask Solomon to save the elk. She had to save him from the prison of his own past. She had to go back to the sanctuary and face the awakened trauma of the friend who had once saved her. The journey back to Solomon's sanctuary was even more difficult than before. A fresh layer of snow had fallen, and the temperature had dropped further. Elara went alone this time. She knew this was a conversation that only the two of them could have. She found him in the same spot, huddled against the rocks, a statue of frozen misery. He didn't even lift his head when she approached. The haunted look in his eyes was deeper. Now he was lost in a memory of a time when the world was fire and pain, and every living thing was a threat. She didn't call out to him. She didn't try to coax him with food. Instead, she did the one thing her heart told her to do. She found a way over the snow-clogged fence and entered his sanctuary. It was a dangerous, reckless act, a violation of every park protocol, but she knew that a fence between them now would be an insurmountable barrier. She needed to be with him in his world, in his pain, She walked slowly through the deep snow until she was standing a few feet from him. "Solomon," she said softly. He flinched at her voice, his muscles tensing, as if preparing for a blow. "It's me, it's Elara." He looked at her, but his eyes were vacant. He didn't see the young woman who was his friend. He saw another figure, a threat from his past. A human with a weapon. "I know you're scared," she continued, her voice a gentle murmur against the vast silence. "I know this feels like before when you were hurt and alone. But you are not alone now. You have me. You have a herd that needs you." She took another slow step forward and began to hum the same soft, tuneless melody. She had hummed to him when he was the broken one, and she was the healer all. Those years ago, the melody was a thread of sound connecting the past to the present. A reminder of the trust they had built, the bond they had forged. Solomon's breathing hitched, a shudder ran through his massive frame. He was fighting a war within himself between the terror of the past and the love of the present. Elara took another step and another until she was standing beside him. She reached out her mittened hand and laid it on his frosty back. "You are not a victim anymore, Solomon," she whispered, her words turning to vapor in the frigid air. "You are a king, and your people are in trouble. They are trapped and starving, and you are the only one who can lead them home." She pressed her forehead against his shaggy side, just as she had done when she was a little girl seeking comfort from him. Now she was the one offering it, pouring all of her strength, all of her love, all of her unwavering belief in him into that single point of contact. She stood like that for a long time, her own body growing numb from the cold, until she felt a subtle shift beneath her cheek. Solomon turned his great head and looked at her, and this time she saw him in his eyes. She saw her friend. His gaze was clear. His breathing was steady. He nudged her gently with his nose, a silent question. Then he let out a low rumble. The sound not of fear, but of resolve. He understood he was ready. She had brought him back from the darkness. The king had returned. If this incredible story of courage and redemption has inspired you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these heartwarming tales of the profound bonds between humans and animals. Your support allows us to continue sharing stories that prove love and empathy can overcome even the most daunting challenges. The mission was on, but Elara knew they couldn't do it alone. While Solomon possessed the strength to break the trail, he would need sustenance for the journey, and the starving elk would need food waiting for them at the end of it. That meant supplies, and lots of them. Elara went to the one person she knew she could count on, not just for materials, but for the kind of stubborn belief that was needed for an impossible task. She walked into the town's feed and supply store, the bell over the door jingling in the frosty air. Kyle was behind the counter stacking bags of grain. He looked up. His usual awkward deference was replaced by genuine concern when he saw the look on Elara's face. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," she replied. "I've seen the future. If we don't do something, a whole herd of elk is going to starve to death up on the mountain." She explained her desperate plan, her voice low and urgent, her need for Solomon, her need for supplies. Kyle listened, his expression shifting from shock to a dawning sense of purpose. He didn't hesitate. He didn't question her sanity. "What do you need?" he asked simply. It was the beginning of an unlikely but powerful alliance. Kyle closed the store and put a sign on the door that read, "Closed for mountain rescue." He loaded his father's powerful long track snowmobile with every bale of hay and bag of high-energy feed he could fit. He rallied the community, using the store's phone tree to call other ranchers and business owners. The town that had once voted to kill Solomon now mobilized to support his heroic mission. A convoy of snowmobiles loaded with supplies was assembled, their headlights cutting through the falling snow as they made their way to the edge of the sanctuary. They were no longer just townspeople. They were Solomon's ground crew, their efforts a testament to how much one girl and one bison had changed the heart of their community. The journey itself was an epic saga of endurance. Solomon led the way, his massive body a living snowplow. He would lower his head and charge into the massive drifts, using his strength and weight to carve a path through the frozen landscape. Elara walked beside him for the first few miles, her presence giving him strength, her hand often resting on his side. But the terrain grew too treacherous and the snow too deep, and she had to fall back, letting him go on alone while she coordinated the supply efforts with Kyle and Ranger Miller. Via radio, she watched him disappear into the swirling snow, a solitary, dark figure on a mission of mercy, her heart a painful mix of pride and terror. For 3 days, Solomon battled the mountain he climbed, the treacherous Serpent's Ridge, following the ancient path that was now just a memory buried under feet of snow. He rested only for short periods, his stamina fueled by an iron will and the hay that the snowmobile teams left for him. At designated drop points on the 4th day, he broke through into the Devil's Cauldron, the starving elk scattered at the sight of the immense beast, their fear palpable. But Solomon did not approach them as a threat, he simply stood at the head of the trail. He had carved a silent invitation. He let out a single low bellow, a call that spoke not of dominance, but of passage. Of a way out, the herd's lead cow, a wise old matriarch, cautiously approached him. She circled him, testing the air, sensing his intent. Then she turned to her herd and called to them, and one by one the entire herd of nearly 200 elk began to follow her into the narrow path, lining up single file behind their unlikely savior. The exodus from the Devil's Cauldron was a sight that none who witnessed it would ever forget. News helicopters that had been grounded by the storm were finally able to fly, and they captured the breathtaking footage of the great Bison leading a river of elk down the mountainside, a modern-day Moses parting not a sea of water but a sea of snow. The townspeople gathered at the foothills, watching in awed silence as the procession emerged from the wilderness. Solomon led the elk to the lower meadows where Kyle and the other volunteers had spread out dozens of bales of hay. His task complete, the great Bison did not linger. He turned and began the long, slow walk back to his own sanctuary, back to the girl who was waiting for him. Elara met him at the sanctuary gate, her face wet with tears of relief and gratitude. She threw her arms around his great neck and buried her face in his shaggy fur. "You did it," she sobbed. "Oh, Solomon, you did it. You saved them all." He nudged her gently, his duty done, his kingly task fulfilled. The long winter finally broke, a few weeks later, giving way to a warm and sudden spring. The mountainside bloomed with wildflowers, and the land was reborn as the snows melted. The story of Solomon's rescue became an enduring legend etched into the history of Montana. He was no longer the ghost bison or the rogue bull. He was Solomon the Great, the king of the Absaroka-Beartooth, a symbol of the profound strength and compassion that lay hidden in the wild heart of the world. Elara continued her work, her bond with Solomon, now something deeper than friendship. It was a partnership, a sacred trust. They had faced the worst the world could throw at them and had emerged not just as survivors but as saviors together. They had proven that even in the harshest winter, in the face of the deepest trauma, hope could break a trail, and that the most powerful force on earth was not the fury of a blizzard, but the unwavering love between a girl and the mysterious Bison who had forever changed her fate. The spring that followed Solomon's great rescue was a time of quiet celebration and deep peace. The Absaroka-Beartooth Mountains seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief as life returned to the valley in vibrant bursts of green and gold. Elara, now a young woman of 18, prepared to graduate from high school. Her journey from the silent ghost girl to a respected local hero was complete. She had found her voice not in volume, but in the quiet confidence of her actions and the profound impact she had on the world around her. The Solomon Sanctuary had become a global symbol of hope. Her work there, alongside Ranger Miller, had drawn the attention of academics and conservationists worldwide. Prestigious universities sent her letters and applications offering full scholarships to their leading animal behavior programs. It was a future she had never dared to dream of, a chance to take the lessons the wilderness had taught her and share them with a world desperately in need of healing. But with this bright promise came a bittersweet ache. Solomon was aging. The great Bison, who had once been a torrent of power and fury, was now a gentle river flowing peacefully toward its end. His shaggy coat was frosted with gray, his movements were slower, more deliberate. He spent more of his days resting on his favorite hill, a quiet king surveying his peaceful kingdom. The thought of leaving him was a physical pain for Elara, a tearing at the very fabric of her soul. He was more than a friend. He was the other half of her heart, the silent guardian who had taught her how to be whole. The day her acceptance letter came from a renowned university program thousands of miles away, she didn't celebrate. Instead, she walked the familiar path to the sanctuary, her future clutched in her hand like a heavy stone. She found Solomon resting in a patch of late afternoon sun. His eyes were closed, but she knew he was aware of her presence. She sat beside her back resting against a familiar pine tree and simply watched him for a long time. The silence between them was as full and comfortable as it had been on the first day they met in the clearing. She didn't need to sign or speak. Her turmoil was a palpable thing, a storm of love and grief, an opportunity that she knew he could sense. How can I leave you? She thought the words, a silent scream in her mind. How can I walk away from the one who taught me how to stand? Solomon opened his ancient eyes. He looked at her, and there was no sadness in his gaze, only a deep and placid understanding. He pushed himself to his feet with a soft groan, his old joints protesting the movement, and walked slowly to the fence. He lowered his great head and nudged her shoulder with his nose. The gesture was not a plea for her to stay. It was a nudge of encouragement, a gentle push forward into the world. He was releasing her. He was teaching her the final and hardest lesson of all, that the ultimate expression of love is not to hold on, but to let go. Tears streamed down Elara's face, and she pressed her forehead against the warm, coarse fur of his cheek. You taught me how to be brave, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. And now I have to be brave enough to say goodbye for a little while. He rumbled low in his chest, a sound of pure contentment and affirmation. He had done his work. He had saved her, and in doing so, he had found his own salvation. Now it was time for her to do her work in the wider world. Her decision was made. She accepted the scholarship, but she spent that final summer creating a new legacy at the sanctuary, working with the community she established. The Solomon Project, a volunteer program that trained young people, especially those struggling with their own traumas, to connect with the rescued animals at the center. It was a way to ensure the healing would continue long after she was gone. Kyle, now a young man who had fully shed the skin of his cruel past, became one of her first and most dedicated volunteers. His gentle way with the animals, a quiet and constant apology for the boy he had once been. The day Elara left for college, the entire town came to see her off. Mrs. Gable hugged her fiercely, her eyes shining with pride. Ranger Frank gave her a worn copy of his favorite book on animal tracking, and Kyle pressed a small hand-carved wooden bison into her palm. So you never forget the king, he said, his voice steady with a newfound maturity. Her last stop was the sanctuary. Solomon was on his hill watching, as he always did. She didn't go to the fence. She simply stood by the gate and raised her hand in their old familiar gesture, the soft opening and closing of her fist, the sign of the released bird. He watched her for a long moment, then turned his great head toward the mountains, a silent acknowledgement, a final farewell, as Elara drove away, the sanctuary shrinking in her rearview mirror. She did not feel the pain of leaving. She felt the strength of what she was carrying with her. She was taking the quiet courage of a lonely girl, the unwavering love of a gentle giant, and the enduring wisdom of the wilderness. Her fate had been changed forever by a mysterious bison, but now she was the one shaping the fate of others, a course of healer sent out into the world, carrying the spirit of the king of the Absaroka-Beartooth in her heart. The world for 10-year-old Elara was a place of muted colors and hushed tones. Ever since the car crash that had stolen her parents 2 years ago, her life had been lived behind a veil of quiet grief, a silence that clung to her more stubbornly than the Montana dust on her worn boots. She lived at the Gable foster home, a sprawling old farmhouse on the edge of the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness. Mrs. Gable was a kind woman, her hands perpetually dusted with flour and her heart filled with good intentions, but she was also a woman stretched thin, with 5 other foster children to care for and a farm to run. She provided, Elara with a clean bed, warm meals, and clothes that fit, but she couldn't fill the cavernous empty space in the little girl's chest. Every day was a study in endurance. The school bus was a rolling cage of taunts and whispers, led by a boy named Kyle, whose own insecurities manifested as a particular brand of cruelty reserved just for her. He called her Ghost Girl. Because of her silence and her pale, withdrawn face, his laughter was a sharp and jagged thing that chipped away at the fragile shell she had built around herself. "Look, it's the orphan," he'd sneer his friends, echoing his jeers. "Lost your parents. So you lost your tongue too." Elara learned to make herself small, to blend into the cracked vinyl of the bus seat, to stare out the window and pretend the jagged peaks of the mountains were a fortress that could protect her from the volley of words that felt like stones. Her only sanctuary was the vast wilderness that began where Mrs. Gable's property ended. Every day after the torment of school, she would escape into the deep woods, following deer trails and the whisper of the wind through the pines. Here in the cathedral of nature, she could breathe here. The silence was a comfort, not a weakness. She would talk to the squirrels and the jays, her voice a soft rustle of leaves telling them secrets she could never entrust to a human soul. It was in this wilderness that she first became aware of him, a local legend, a creature of myth and fear. The townspeople called him the Ghost Bison, a solitary giant who haunted the fringes of the national park. They said he was a rogue bull, kicked out of his herd for his violent temper, a dangerous outcast who had gored a hunter's truck and chased hikers from the trails. He was a shadow, a mystery, a monster to be avoided at all costs. His real name was Solomon, though no one in town knew it. And for weeks, Elara only ever saw him from a distance, a massive dark shape moving through the trees, his presence a silent and powerful hum in the landscape. But she wasn't afraid of him in his solitude. She saw a reflection of her own in his rumored rejection. She felt a kindred spirit. One day the cruelty reached a new peak. Kyle and his friends had cornered her during recess, their words sharper, their shoves more insistent. Elara endured it with her usual stoic silence, but inside something had cracked. The bus ride home was a blur of hot tears she couldn't shed. When the bus stopped at her long gravel driveway, she didn't head for the farmhouse. She ran. She fled toward the one place she felt safe, the woods, her small legs pumping, her lungs burning. She ran from the laughter, the whispers, the gnawing ache of being alone in the world. She ran until the sounds of the farm faded and were replaced by the rhythmic hush of the forest floor. She ran farther than she ever had before, her desperation pushing her deeper into the wilderness until her legs finally gave out and she collapsed in a small, sun-dappled clearing, sobbing into the damp earth, the tears she had held back for so long finally breaking free in a gut-wrenching torrent. She cried for her parents, for the life she had lost, for the constant thrum of pain that was her daily companion. She didn't know how long she lay there, a small broken heap in the heart of the wild, but when her sobs finally subsided, she felt a strange stillness in the air, a presence. She slowly lifted her tear-streaked face from the dirt, and her breath caught in her throat. Standing not 20 feet away was him, the Ghost Bison, Solomon. He was larger than she could have ever imagined, a mountain of shaggy fur and coiled muscle. His massive head was lowered, his horns like polished crescents of old ivory, and his eyes, dark and ancient, regarded her with an unnerving calm. This was the monster, the dangerous rogue, the creature of terrifying local legend. Her every instinct screamed at her to run, but she was paralyzed by a mixture of awe and exhaustion. He simply stood there, his breath misting in the cool air, his immense presence filling the clearing. Then she heard voices from the edge of the woods. Kyle and his friends had followed her, their taunts cutting through the sacred silence. "Look, she's found a new freak to be friends with," Kyle shouted, his voice laced with nervous bravado. "The Ghost Girl and the Ghost Bison, a perfect match." They laughed, but they didn't dare step into the clearing. The Bison's presence was a palpable wall of power that even their foolish courage couldn't breach. Elara expected the Bison to charge, to let out a roar of fury at the intrusion, but Solomon did nothing. He kept his gaze fixed on her, his dark eyes seeming to hold a question. Then he did something that would change Elara's fate forever. he let out a low, soft sound, a deep rumble that vibrated through the ground. And into her bones, it wasn't a sound of aggression or threat. It was a sound of comfort, a sound that seemed to say, "I see you. You are not alone," in that moment. Elara's fear dissolved, completely replaced by a profound and inexplicable sense of connection. She saw past the legend, past the fear, and saw a creature as lonely as she was. They were two outcasts, two ghosts haunting the edges of a world that didn't want them, the bullies, their taunts falling flat against the bison's immense indifference. Eventually grew bored and retreated, their laughter fading into the woods. Elara was left alone in the clearing with the giant beast. She slowly pushed herself to a sitting position, her eyes never leaving his. He watched her, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm, a living metronome of peace. She stayed there for what felt like hours, the sun slanting through the trees, casting long shadows around them. She didn't speak, she didn't move, she simply existed in his presence, feeling a sense of safety she hadn't known since her parents. Arms were last around her when she finally stood up to leave, her legs shaky, but her heart strangely full. Solomon watched her go. He didn't follow, but he stood in the clearing until she was out of sight, a silent guardian watching over his newfound friend. As Elara walked back to the farmhouse under the bruised twilight sky, she knew something inside her had shifted. The daily hurt was still there, a dull ache in her memory, but it was no longer the only thing. She felt she now had a secret, a friend, a mysterious bison who had looked at her with her pain and had not run away. He had changed her fate without taking a single aggressive step. Have you ever found an unexpected connection with an animal that seemed to understand you in a way no human could? What is it about these silent bonds that can be so incredibly healing? The clearing in the woods became Elara's sacred space, her true home. Every day after school, she would bypass the farmhouse and slip into the forest, her heart pulling her toward the one being on earth who seemed to understand her silence. Their friendship blossomed in the quiet language of shared solitude. Solomon was always there, as if waiting for her. He would be grazing peacefully or resting under the shade of a great ponderosa pine. At the moment she entered the clearing, his massive head would lift, his dark eyes acknowledging her arrival. She would sit near him, sometimes leaning against the warm, rough bark of a tree, and she would talk, her voice soft and hesitant at first, then growing stronger as she shared the stories of her day. She told him about the biting words of the bullies, the well-meaning but distant kindness of Mrs. Gable, the hollow ache that filled her room at night. She told him about her parents, her memories of them like faded photographs she was afraid of forgetting. Solomon would listen, his stillness a form of. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.